Hi, we're in our final module of this semester, Postmodernism and Postcolonialism, which begins roughly 1965 to the present. And I do mean roughly. Keep in mind that the qualities listed do not always apply to each and every writer termed postmodernist or postcolonial. As with any label, particularly with artistic movements, there are aspects found in some artists that are not to be found in others. Still, these concepts can help to separate this movement from the modernist writers. And if you think about it really, we probably see less clearly the writers of today than writers of any other earlier historical time period, right? Because we're still involved with it. So it's very hard to truly understand what's going on as you're actually in the midst of it. But there are certain things that we can probably put our finger on. First of all, with postmodernism. Postmodernism is very experimental in forms, and it questions the assumptions about the forms and what they bring to the genre, such as a novel, a play, right? So Beckett is an obvious example of a play that, well, quite frankly, blows up the expectations we have of plays. Continues and pushes further ideas of modernism, such as alienation, historical discontinuity, and solipsism, right? It's all about me and what I experience, that sort of thing. Existentialism is a strong influence. So existentialism you can almost see as an extended or more extreme form of materialism. There is no God, therefore talk of spiritual life is irrelevant. All we know is what is in front of us. And quite frankly, that makes concepts of morality and ethical behavior very difficult. Or you kind of make it up for yourself individually as you go along, because there is no greater good. There is no bigger picture. There is no divine being giving us a sense of what we should or should not do. In postmodernism, myth gives way to the experience of aesthetic surfaces. It's as though all that matters is what we see on the surface. Anything else is irrelevant. Also continuing from modernism is this movement away from an ordered universe. Instead, highly fragmented universes, plural, are created. You can kind of see how this is coming down the pike when you look at writers such as Virginia Woolf or T.S. Eliot or James Joyce. Right? That individual experience leads more and more to a greater sense that there is no single way in which something is, and that the order of a universe is highly subjective. We also see the rise of the anti-hero. Now, please understand the concept of the anti-hero is not the same thing as a villain or an antagonist. The anti-hero is the protagonist. But this is a protagonist whose values, whose ethics are different from a society at large. They have their own sense of ethics, of right and wrong. They're just different. And often the anti-hero rises up to save a person or a people or a concept, but they do it in a very different sort of way. The anti-hero is a very flawed individual. They're not Superman. They're not Beowulf. Right? They're not the traditional hero that you think of. Of course, with Great Britain, you have the issue of colonies. I mean, the United States has colonies, but nearly to the extent that Great Britain did. There was that old line, the sun never sets on the British Empire, until it did. And one by one, colonies around the world separated themselves from Great Britain. But, of course, one of the things that happened is that many people from those countries immigrated to Great Britain to begin a new and better life. Now, you might think to yourself, well, this is very familiar to the United States. And to a certain extent it is, although not exactly in the same way. But we've been living with immigration as part of our nation since its very founding. Great Britain did not. And so this rise of immigration into the UK is a relatively new experience, right? It's not something they've had a couple hundred years of experience with. So the issues of the immigrant experience, including bringing to Great Britain the issues of their originating home country. So again, we in the United States may automatically connect to certain aspects of the immigrant experience, right? But think of it this way. This is a post-war, meaning post-World War II, phenomenon for the most part. And it's a little different from the Ellis Island mythology that we have in the United States. There is experimentation with language, idiom, and dialect. As people come to Great Britain speaking English, but not the Queen's English. Not exactly the way that you might expect somebody to speak English correctly, quote unquote. And so writers of different sorts will expand on this to greater or lesser extent. But there is definitely some experimentation with language, idiom, and dialect. The immigrants to Great Britain expected to find a new and better life. One of the things, of course, they found was discrimination. Racial, social, religious, class discrimination. And that is, of course, part of the post-colonial experience. Also is kind of a complexity of gender roles and expectations. If in Great Britain women enjoyed more freedom in terms of the gender roles and expectations, education, jobs, potential, etc., many immigrants came from countries where women were in much more conservative roles, where their expectations were much more, let's call it, traditional. And that creates conflict. For many of the writers of the post-colonial time, there's a rejection of the literary canon. That is to say, as they look at Shakespeare and the others, how do they respond? They might be completely rejected, they might be accepted, they might be manipulated or partially accepted and partially rejected. But for the most part, you can't just simply take somebody who's coming from another nation, another country, in another part of the world, with different experiences, and say, okay, here's Shakespeare, here's Milton, here's Chaucer, here's Spencer, and expect them to wholeheartedly embrace them. Even with James Joyce, the Irish writer, he has that famous passage in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, where Stephen Dedalus is talking to the English convert, who is now a dean, and he talks to him about language. You may remember the passage around the word tundish. It's one of my favorite passages to talk about. The dream of a new life crashes into the reality. And again, this is maybe one of the prime experiences for immigrants, is you come, whether it's to the United States or to Great Britain, thinking life is going to be one way, but more often than not, it's really kind of something rather different. And that, of course, finds its way into the literature that we read.